You know, in this business, you meet all kinds of people. You meet giants who look like they were carved out of stone. You meet high flyers who seem to defy gravity itself. And then sometimes you meet a couple of guys from Detroit who paint their faces like clowns and rap about things that most people wouldn't dare to. I'm talking about Insane Clown Posse, Violent J and Shaggy 2, Dope. To millions, they are hip-hop icons. They created a whole culture, the Juggalos, who are some of the most dedicated fans you will ever find anywhere. But there's another side to their story, a side that is near and dear to my own heart. It's their deep, lifelong love for professional wrestling. Long before they were selling out concerts or creating their own music empire, Jay and Shaggy were just two kids who were captivated by the larger-than-life world of pro wrestling. They watched guys like me, The Rock, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, but their fandom went back even further. They were fans of the territories, the blood and guts style of wrestling that I grew up on. It wasn't just a casual interest for them, it was a passion. They saw the storytelling, the athleticism, and the raw emotion, and they knew, deep down, that they wanted to be a part of it. They didn't just want a front row seat. They wanted to step through those ropes and feel the canvas under their boots. This wasn't just a gimmick to sell more records. Their love for wrestling was completely genuine. You can hear it in their music, you can see it in their old interviews, and you could definitely feel it when they were anywhere near a wrestling ring. They understood the respect that the business demands. They knew that you couldn't just walk in and pretend. You had to earn your spot. So, while they were building one of the most unique movements in music history, another dream was always simmering on the back burner. The dream of trading in the microphone for a steel chair, just for a little while, and becoming professional wrestlers. It's a wild story, but in wrestling, the wildest stories are often the best ones. The journey from being a fan to becoming a performer is a tough one. I should know. It's a path filled with pain, sacrifice, and a lot of people telling you that you can't do it. For two guys who were already famous musicians, it was even stranger. Why would they risk injury? Why would they risk the rejection of a whole new audience? The answer is simple, because they loved it. They loved wrestling with the same passion that their fans, the Juggalos, love their music. And when you love something that much, you're willing to do whatever it takes to be a part of it. Their story in wrestling isn't about winning championships. It's about chasing a dream with everything you've got. Every wrestler has an origin story. Mine started with a superfly splash off a rooftop. For Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope, it started in the backyards of Detroit. Before they were Insane Clown Posse, they were part of a group that ran their own small local wrestling federation. They would set up makeshift rings and put on shows for their friends and whoever else would watch. It was raw, it was dangerous, and it was filled with the kind of passion you only find when you're young and chasing a crazy dream. They were learning the basics the hard way, by just going out there and doing it, taking bumps on unforgiving ground and figuring out what worked. As their music career started to take off, their wrestling dream didn't fade away. In fact, it got stronger. They knew that backyard wrestling wasn't enough. If they were going to do this for real, they needed real training. So they sought out some of the toughest guys in the business to teach them. They trained with the legendary Al Snow, a guy who knows more about the fundamentals of this business than almost anyone I can think of. They also learned from Sabu, one of the most fearless and innovative wrestlers to ever step foot in a ring. These weren't easy teachers. They demanded respect for the craft, and Jay and Shaggy were ready to give it. The training was brutal. It's a shock to the system for anyone, let alone two guys who were also touring and recording albums. You have to learn how to fall, how to run the ropes, how to throw a punch that looks real but keeps your opponent safe. It's a dance, and it's a painful one to learn. But they stuck with it. They took the bumps. They listened to their trainers, and they slowly started to transform from musicians who loved wrestling into musicians who could actually wrestle. They weren't trying to become the next Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels. They wanted to be themselves, but as wrestlers. They wanted to bring their unique energy into the squared circle. This period was so important because it showed their commitment. It's one thing to say you love wrestling. It's another thing entirely to let a guy like Sabu stretch you until you feel like you're going to snap, and then get up and do it all over again the next day. They were paying their dues, just like every other guy who starts at the bottom. They even started their own small promotion again, a precursor to what would become Juggalo Championship Wrestling. They were booking shows, setting up rings, and wrestling on the same cards as the local indie guys. They were immersing themselves completely in the world they had admired for so long. In 1998, the World Wrestling Federation was the wildest place on earth. The Attitude Era was in full swing, and anything could happen. It was the perfect time for two face-painted rappers to make their entrance. ICP arrived in the WWF and were quickly introduced as part of a group called the Oddities. This was a faction of, well, oddballs. You had the gigantic Kurgan, the towering Golga, and the unforgettable Luna Vachon. Jay and Shaggy fit right in with this crew of misfits. Their role was to perform the group's entrance theme live as they made their way to the ring. It was a sight to behold, a true spectacle that perfectly captured the chaos of the era. Their time in the WWF wasn't just about music, though. They got their chance to get in the ring and mix it up. They found themselves in tag team matches, often teaming with their fellow oddities against crews like Kaientai. Now, were they technical masters? No. But they brought an energy and a brawling style that was fun to watch. They weren't afraid to get hit, and they weren't afraid to throw some wild punches. The fans didn't always know what to make of them. Some crowds cheered, some booed, but nobody was indifferent. They were a spectacle, and in the WWF, that's a valuable commodity. Having them on the show was a guaranteed what the heck was that moment. One of their most memorable moments came at SummerSlam that year. They performed live at one of the biggest shows of the year, which is a huge deal for any performer. But behind the scenes, things weren't always perfect. Jay and Shaggy have spoken about feeling a bit disrespected by some of the people in the locker room. That's not uncommon for outsiders, especially celebrity types, who come into the wrestling world. It can be a very guarded business. They felt like they weren't being taken seriously as performers who truly loved wrestling, but were instead seen as just a musical act brought in for a cheap pop. That kind of thing can wear on you. Ultimately, their time in the WWF was short. They had a disagreement with management over a planned spot in a match, which involved them taking a move from the Headbangers. They felt it was a move that would make them look weak and foolish, and they stood their ground. That decision led to their departure from the company. It was a bumpy ride, for sure. But they got to perform at SummerSlam, they wrestled on Raw, and they shared a locker room with some of the biggest legends in the history of the business. It was a wild, strange chapter in their wrestling story, but it was far from the last one. After their cup of coffee in the WWF, you might think ICP would have hung up their boots for good, but their wrestling fire was still burning bright. So, they headed down south to World Championship Wrestling. In WCW, they found a creative environment that seemed much more suited to their Dark Carnival-esque style. They weren't just a musical act anymore. They were brought in as legitimate characters and wrestlers, and they quickly formed an alliance with a wrestler who shared their gothic sensibilities, the one and only Vampiro. Together, they were a force of chaos, and it felt like a much more natural fit than their time with the Oddities. Their first big program saw them team up with Vampiro in a faction called the Dead Pool. They were a menacing trio, and they were immediately thrown into the fire against some of WCW's top talent. They had memorable feuds with guys like Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, and Conan. Think about that for a second. These two rappers from Detroit were in a WCW ring, trading blows with some of the greatest performers of all time. They weren't just standing on the apron either. They were taking bumps, getting involved in the action, and proving that they were more than willing to get their hands dirty. They were earning the respect they had been looking for. Later, their group expanded and evolved. When the legendary Raven joined them, the faction was renamed the Dark Carnival. This was ICP's vision brought to life on a grand stage. The imagery, the promos, the dark and chaotic energy, it was everything they represented. They were no longer just guests in the wrestling world. They were helping to shape a part of it. They participated in some wild matches, including brawls that spilled all over the arena. They were having the time of their lives, and you could see it. They were getting to live out their wrestling fantasies alongside some of their heroes. Their run in WCW was significant because it legitimized them as wrestling personalities. They were treated as a credible threat, and were involved in meaningful storylines that played out on Nitro and Thunder every week. They faced off against filthy animals, they tangled with legends, and they got to show a massive television audience what they were all about. While WCW itself was going through a chaotic time, for ICP, it was a golden era. It was where they proved to everyone that their love for wrestling was real, and that they belonged inside the squared circle just as much as anyone else. After their time in the big leagues of WWF and WCW, you'd think ICP had seen it all. But there was one more place they had to check off their list, a place known for being the most violent, passionate, and downright crazy wrestling promotion on the planet. Extreme Championship Wrestling. ECW was the land of barbed wire, flaming tables, and honestly, the most hardcore fans you could ever imagine. In early 2000, Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope made an appearance at an ECW show in Philadelphia, the heartland of Extreme. On paper, it seemed like a perfect match. ICP's chaotic energy and ECW's hardcore style should have gone together like a chair shot to the head. They came out to the ring to do what they do best, talk to the crowd and get them hyped up. But, the ECW faithful were a tough bunch. They were fiercely loyal to their guys, the wrestlers who bled for them every night in that bingo hall. They saw ICP as outsiders, as corporate creations from the big companies they despised. The reaction was not what Jay and Shaggy were expecting. The boos were deafening. The crowd let them have it, chanting insults and making it clear that these clowns were not welcome in their house. It was a brutal reception, and honestly, one of the toughest crowds they had ever faced in their entire careers. Things went from bad to worse. As ICP tried to win the crowd over, they got into a confrontation with the heel faction that was in the ring. This led to the ECW locker room, led by the legendary Sandman, emptying out to confront the clowns. It was a chaotic scene, a mix of a planned storyline and very real tension. The ECW wrestlers were protective of their turf, and they let ICP know it. The segment ended with a massive brawl, but the damage was done. The Philadelphia crowd had rejected them completely, and it was clear that this was not going to be a long-term home for them. Their appearance in ECW was basically a one-night-only affair. The hostile reaction from the fans and the tense atmosphere backstage made it a short and not-so-sweet visit. It was a harsh lesson, a reminder that in wrestling, respect is everything, and it's not always given freely. Even for guys who loved the business as much as they did, some doors were harder to open than others. While it was a negative experience, it was also an important one. It showed them that if they truly wanted a wrestling world that embraced them and their fans, they might just have to build it themselves. After bouncing between WWF, WCW, and ECW, Insane Clown Posse decided it was time to take matters into their own hands. If they couldn't find the perfect home in the world of professional wrestling, they would build one from the ground up. This led to the creation of Juggalo Championship Wrestling, or JCW. Now, this wasn't just another independent promotion. This was a wrestling company built in ICP's own image, chaotic, wild, a little bit weird, and totally dedicated to pure, unadulterated fun. It was a place where their music, their culture, and their love for wrestling could all come together under one roof. The atmosphere at a JCW show is honestly unlike anything else in wrestling. Imagine a wrestling event breaking out in the middle of a massive non-stop party. That's JCW. The shows are often held as part of their annual music festival, the Gathering of the Juggalos. The fans, The juggalos are a huge part of the experience. They're loud, they're passionate, and they're there to have a good time. There's music, there's wrestling, and of course there are gallons and gallons of Faygo soda being sprayed everywhere. It's a carnival of chaos, and it's a place where everyone is welcome, as long as you're there to have fun. What made JCW special was the incredible mix of talent they brought in. They didn't just fill their roster with unknown wrestlers, they brought in absolute legends of the business. Guys like me, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Vampiro, and Sabu all wrestled for JCW. They also gave a platform to incredible independent wrestlers, guys who were making a name for themselves across the country. It was a place where a young, up-and-coming wrestler could share a locker room with a Hall of Famer. Jay and Shaggy created an environment where everyone was treated with respect, an environment they had been searching for their whole careers. The main events of JCW were often centered around ICP themselves. They would team up with their allies to take on whatever villains were trying to ruin the party. They had long-running storylines and championship titles, just like any other promotion. But the focus was always on entertainment. They put on Bloody Mania, their version of WrestleMania, which became a huge annual event. JCW became more than just a vanity project. It became a legitimate and beloved part of the independent wrestling scene, a testament to ICP's dedication and their ability to create something lasting and special for their fans. When you talk about a wrestler's style, you might think of technical wrestling, high-flying, or powerhouse moves. But when you talk about Insane Clown Posse's style in the ring, the words that come to mind are brawling, comedy, and pure, chaotic energy. Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope were never going to be mistaken for Dean Malenko or Kurt Angle, and they knew that. They weren't trying to win matches with a perfect dropkick or a complex submission hold. Their goal was to entertain the crowd by creating a spectacle, and they did that by embracing what they were good at, being wild and unpredictable. Their matches were often straight-up brawls. They loved to use weapons, chairs, trash cans, cookie sheets, you name it. It was a style that I can certainly appreciate. It was messy, it was impactful, and it felt real. They would throw wild punches and take big bumps, often spilling the action outside of the ring and into the crowd. This style was perfect for the kind of stories they told. They were the underdogs, the clowns fighting against the bullies, and a good old-fashioned brawl is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter how polished your opponent is when you're hitting them with a stop sign. It was a style born from their love of old-school, hardcore wrestling. But it wasn't all just brawling. A huge part of their in-ring performance was comedy. They understood the entertainment aspect of sports entertainment better than most. They would use silly spots, goofy mannerisms, and their natural charisma to make the audience laugh. One of their signature moves, of course, involved their favorite beverage, Faygo. They would often bring bottles of soda to the ring and use them as weapons, spraying their opponents and the crowd in a sticky mess. It was their version of a stone-cold beer bash or a Sandman cane shot. It was uniquely them, and the fans absolutely loved it. This combination of hardcore brawling and lighthearted comedy created a unique energy that you couldn't find anywhere else. Their matches were fun. You never knew what was going to happen, but you knew you were going to be entertained. They weren't afraid to look silly, and they weren't afraid to get hurt. That's a rare combination. They brought the same kind of energy to a wrestling match that they brought to a live concert. It was loud, it was in your face, and it was designed to make you feel something. Whether you were cheering or booing, you were paying attention. And in wrestling, that's half the battle. One of the most incredible parts of ICP's wrestling journey is the list of legendary names they got to share a ring with. This wasn't just a case of being on the same show. They were in there, locking up, telling stories, and creating moments with some of the biggest stars in the history of the business. Think about their time in WCW. They were in the ring against guys like Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero. These are two of the most gifted performers to ever live, and there they were, trading moves with Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope. It's a testament to how wild the wrestling world can be. Their list of opponents and partners reads like a who's who of wrestling. In WCW, they teamed with Vampiro and Raven. In their own promotion, JCW, they brought in a staggering amount of talent. They wrestled alongside and against guys like Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, two of the coolest and most influential figures of the 90s. They brought in the hardcore icon Sabu, who had been one of their trainers, and had wild, weapon-filled brawls with him. They even worked with guys like the Rock and Roll Express, one of the greatest tag teams of all time. They were like kids in a candy store, getting to play with all of their favorite action figures. It wasn't just about wrestling against the big names, either. It was about the respect they showed them. When they started JCW, they made it a place where the legends were treated like legends. They paid them well, they treated them with respect in the locker room, and they gave them the spotlight. For many of these veterans, JCW was a fun and rewarding place to work. It was a low-pressure environment where they could still go out, perform for a hot crowd, and have a good time. ICP weren't just using these legends for their name value. They were genuinely honoring the guys they grew up idolizing. For Jay and Shaggy, these experiences were the dream come true. Can you imagine being a lifelong fan and suddenly finding yourself in a tag team match with Kevin Nash as your partner? Or looking across the ring and seeing Eddie Guerrero ready to go? It's surreal, but they never looked out of place. They held their own, they took the moves, they got their spots in, and they earned the respect of these veterans. They weren't just celebrities playing wrestler for a day. They were part of the show, part of the story, and they created memories that both they and the fans will never forget. It's a truly remarkable part of their legacy. When you look back at the wild ride of Insane Clown Posse in professional wrestling, it's easy to dismiss it as a novelty. Two famous rappers playing wrestler, but that completely misses the point. This was never just a gimmick for them. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, pursued with genuine passion and an incredible amount of heart. Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope weren't the most technically sound wrestlers to ever step through the ropes. They would be the first to tell you that. But wrestling isn't always about being the best athlete. It's about connecting with a crowd and making them feel something. And that is something ICP knew how to do better than almost anyone. They faced tough crowds and backstage politics. They were booed out of buildings and told they didn't belong, but they never gave up on their dream. When the established companies didn't fully embrace their vision, they went out and built their own world. Juggalo Championship Wrestling is a testament to their dedication. They created a space where their fans, the Juggalos, could experience the wrestling they loved in an environment that welcomed them with open arms. They brought new fans to the wrestling business, people who might have never watched a match before but came to see the clowns. That is always a good thing for the industry. Their legacy in wrestling isn't about championship belts or five-star matches. It's about the joy they brought to the ring and the joy they clearly got from being in it. You could see it on their faces every time they stepped through the ropes. They were having the time of their lives, and that feeling was infectious. They proved that you don't have to fit a certain mold to make your mark in this business. All you need is passion, a willingness to work hard, and the courage to be yourself. Even if yourself is a wicked clown who loves to spray soda everywhere. It's a lesson that goes far beyond the wrestling ring. In the end, Insane Clown Posse lived out a fantasy that millions of wrestling fans have every time they watch a show. They didn't just watch from the cheap seats. They got in the ring and mixed it up with legends. They took the bumps, they bled, they laughed, and they entertained. They carved out their own unique, crazy, and wonderful little corner of the professional wrestling universe. They weren't just visitors. They became part of the fabric of the business they loved so much. And for that, whether you're a juggalo or not, they deserve a ton of respect. Whoop whoop.